You'd think being a former U.S. president would guarantee a life of luxury, but that's not always the case. From financial hardship to personal choices, buckle up as we reveal which former U.S. presidents lived like paupers. Number 12, Harry S. Truman. Imagine being the leader of the free world, holding the highest office in the land, only to return to a life so humble it almost resembled poverty. As the 33rd President of the United States, he rose to power unexpectedly after the sudden death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945. He was thrust into the nation's highest office during one of the most pivotal moments in history. World War II was drawing to a close, and the Cold War was taking shape. During Truman's presidency, atomic bombs were used on Japan, the United Nations was created, and the Marshall Plan was launched to rebuild Europe. Despite leading the country through momentous events, Truman maintained a remarkably pragmatic attitude throughout his term. Truman was known for his humble lifestyle, preferring modest clothing and home-cooked meals to the lavish luxuries of the presidency. He and his wife, Bess, would return to their simple Missouri home during breaks from the White House, showing little interest in a luxury offered to them. Truman famously uttered the phrase, "The responsibility lies here," emphasizing his commitment to accountability and personal responsibility, a principle that also shaped his life after the presidency. After leaving office in 1953, Truman returned to his hometown of Independence, Missouri. Unlike many modern presidents who capitalize on their post-presidential status through lucrative book and speaking engagements, Truman refused to monetize his position for personal gain. He rejected offers of commercial sponsorship, claiming that doing so would degrade the dignity of the presidency. He declined multiple offers of consulting fees and board memberships, believing that his service to the country had been payment enough. Truman's financial situation was desperate. After leaving office, the former president had no pension to rely on. Presidential pensions were established later, in 1958. Because of his circumstances, his only income came from his military pension as a retired officer, which was a meager $112.56 per month. Truman and his wife Bess famously took a cross-country road trip in 1953 without Secret Service protection or a large entourage. They packed up their Chrysler New Yorker and set off to explore the United States as ordinary citizens. The trip, during which they stayed in modest motels and ate at local restaurants, reflected Truman's rejection of any special privileges, despite having been the most powerful man in the world just months before. This humble lifestyle continued into Truman's retirement, and his modest home in Independence became a national landmark. Truman lived without luxuries, answering his own phone and even personally replying to fan mail. When asked about his simple lifestyle, he often joked that all he needed were three things: an old car, a good suit, and a clear conscience. If you're enjoying these fun facts, subscribe now so you don't miss any new videos. Number 11, James Monroe. While Truman lived a life that often mirrored that of an ordinary citizen after his presidency, another former leader, James Monroe, also faced an unexpected reality after leaving office. The fifth President of the United States is often remembered for his role in shaping the nation during a period of expansion and transition. But there's more to his story than just the famous Monroe Doctrine and his diplomatic successes. Behind the scenes, Monroe faced financial hardship and lived a simple life that influenced both his presidency and the years that followed. Monroe's time as president was characterized by a simple lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to the growing wealth in some parts of America. His home, Highland Plantation in Virginia, was more about duty than luxury. Unlike today's lavish presidential residences, Highland was a modest home where Monroe lived with basic furnishings. He was careful with his spending, avoiding unnecessary expenses and focusing instead on the essentials. This simplicity wasn't just a personal choice for Monroe. It was also necessary due to limited sources of income compared to modern standards. With little room for financial error, he demonstrated prudence, a quality admired by many who observe presidents. From humble origins, he served as an example of resilience and frugality. Monroe was driven by values deeply rooted in Republican virtue and public service. He believed in serving citizens with integrity and transparency, often prioritizing the national interest over personal gain. He frequently walked instead of using government-provided transportation to save taxpayer money. His commitment to service extended beyond his presidential duties. A notable example is when he personally financed portions of the nation's defense during the War of 1812. In the early days of America, living simply was not always a choice, but often a necessity. For many, society valued self-sufficiency and modesty, an environment in which Monroe's life fit naturally. Although he was a leader, he was not immune to the financial struggles that plagued ordinary citizens. The years following Monroe's presidency clearly demonstrate this. Deeply in debt after leaving office, even keeping up with his plantation became an uphill battle. He turned to Congress for help, a difficult task, as obtaining approval proved challenging amidst political complexities. After Elizabeth Monroe's death, James found himself living with his daughter due to financial constraints that prevented him from owning a home. Number 10. Jimmy Carter Monroe. He wasn't the only president who faced hardship in retirement. Another former leader who redefined modest living in his post-presidential years was Jimmy Carter. While many expect former presidents to enjoy luxury, Carter's life after the White House took an unexpected turn that continues to surprise people to this day. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, is often celebrated for his strong commitment to human rights and energy conservation. However, during his term, despite the noble ideals he championed, his presidency ended with unfavorable approval ratings. Yet, it is his post-presidential life that has truly captured the admiration of many. Carter's lifestyle, living modestly in Plains, Georgia, stands in stark contrast to the luxury typically associated with former heads of state. In the picturesque town of Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter chose to reside in a house valued far below the extravagant mansions occupied by many former presidents. This humble abode speaks volumes about Carter's values and priorities. Instead of indulging in luxury, he immersed himself in community life, where neighbors are friends and simplicity is valued. After his presidency, Carter dedicated himself to humanitarian work, primarily through Habitat for Humanity. Even in his 90s, he demonstrated tireless dedication by physically participating in the construction of homes for those in need. Despite having been president, Carter's lifestyle choices are refreshingly down to earth. For example, instead of opting for private jets or first-class flights, he often flies commercial, a choice that surprises and delights fellow passengers who recognize him on board. Shopping at stores like Dollar General is another example of his down-to-earth nature. These small but significant habits paint the picture of a leader who practices what he preaches. One memorable example occurred when Carter was seen disembarking a flight with his own luggage, an image that resonates with authenticity and approachability rarely associated with figures of such stature. Another story recounts how he continues to teach Sunday school at his local church, sharing wisdom not from a pedestal, but among his peers. Carter's humble life of service after the presidency was not an isolated event in American history. Long before him, there was another president whose post-White House years were similarly notable for their simplicity and dedication to the public good. If this video is making you more curious about the world, give it a like or a thumbs up. Let's continue. Number 9, Rutherford B. Hayes. He is one of the most interesting figures in American presidential history. As the 19th President of the United States, he came to power after one of the most hotly contested elections, which ultimately brought an end to Reconstruction in the South. His presidency was marked by efforts to heal a nation still grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War, though these efforts often caused controversy and division. Despite the challenges he faced during his presidency, Hayes remained true to his principles and kept his campaign promise. He served only one term and did not run for re-election. This choice, driven by principle rather than political ambition, set him apart from many other presidents of his time. It also paved the way for a post-presidential life focused on simplicity and service. In contrast to the turbulent years he spent leading the country, after leaving office, Hayes returned to Fremont, Ohio, where he embraced a quiet life, away from the public eye. In this peaceful environment, Hayes found a new purpose and dedicated much of his time to two key areas. He strongly supported educational initiatives because he believed education was crucial to reducing economic inequality, a belief that guided him throughout his life. He also worked tirelessly to improve conditions within prisons and championed reforms that would give inmates a chance at rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Despite having opportunities that could have made him wealthy after his presidency, Hayes remained focused on public service. When comparing the net worth of U.S. presidents, Hayes stands out as an example of someone who lived like the less fortunate, truly embodying what it means to live simply while striving for greater social good. Number 8, Ulysses S. Grant. While Hayes chose a life of quiet simplicity after his presidency, another American leader would face a far more turbulent existence after the White House. Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, is often remembered for his military genius that helped the Union secure victory during the Civil War. President from 1869 to 1877, his leadership was marked by efforts to stabilize post-war America and enforce civil rights. However, beneath the surface of his political career lay a saga of personal and financial struggles that paints him as a former U.S. president who lived like a pauper. After leaving the White House, Grant's life took a dramatic turn. Despite the prestige of his presidency, he found himself mired in financial trouble. His problems began when he was swindled by a business partner, Ferdinand Ward. Known as the young Napoleon of Wall Street, Ward set up a Ponzi scheme through his firm Grant & Ward, which ultimately collapsed in 1884. This disaster wiped out Grant's savings and left him nearly destitute. The timing could not have been worse. Shortly after this financial catastrophe, Grant was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. With little prospect of recovery or financial security, he turned to writing as a last resort to support his family. In his final years, Grant demonstrated incredible strength. He began writing his memoirs not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Despite suffering terrible pain from his illness, he worked hard and finished them just days before he died in 1885. The memoirs were published posthumously and became an instant and consistent success, bringing significant financial relief to his family. Grant's financial troubles highlighted how former presidents were not adequately supported at the time. The President's Pension Act, which today guarantees a pension for former presidents, was not established until 1958, long after Grant's death. Number 7, Calvin Coolidge. When you think of the Roaring Twenties, luxury and exuberance often come to mind. Enter Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, who, believe it or not, took a distinctly different path after the sudden death of Warren Shee Harding. Coolidge became president. He was known for his modesty and simplicity. His lifestyle consisted of keeping things simple in an era when everyone else seemed to be living extravagantly. People didn't just talk about him as thrifty. He had specific habits that he followed religiously. Instead of elegant state dinners, he preferred home-cooked meals. And instead of buying new clothes, he mended old ones. These daily choices showed his belief that having less is better than having less. Sometimes it can be more. Even while residing in the White House, Coolidge kept a personal ledger, meticulously tracking every expense down to the last penny. He was famous for avoiding government cars unless absolutely necessary, preferring instead to walk or take public transportation. These practices weren't just for show. They were deeply rooted in his philosophy about government and life itself. Affectionately known as Silent Cal, Coolidge was characterized by his quiet demeanor and conservative fiscal policies. His hands-off approach wasn't just political rhetoric. It reflected his broader views on wealth accumulation rather than public service. In speeches and writings that have survived throughout history, Coolidge always championed the values he upheld in public service over personal gain. Wealth comes from industry and thrift, he once remarked, encapsulating his belief that prosperity should not lead to wastefulness, but instead be an opportunity for prudent stewardship. His post-presidential years reflected this same character, living quietly without fanfare or ostentatious displays of wealth. His decisions reflected his belief that true wealth lies in service and simplicity, establishing him as a former president who adopted a lifestyle reminiscent of the less fortunate. Number 6, John Quincy Adams, a name that brings to mind diplomacy, academic pursuits, and an unwavering commitment to public service. As the son of John Adams, one might assume a life of prestige and abundance. However, his story is one of modest living and unwavering principles, which speaks volumes about the financial struggles of former presidents. Before becoming president, John Quincy Adams held many important positions. He was a skilled diplomat who served in various roles throughout Europe. His contributions were crucial in shaping foreign policy, earning him a reputation as a brilliant statesman. However, when it came time for his presidency, from 1825 to 1829, things took an unexpected turn. Despite his diplomatic brilliance, his presidency faced political opposition and mediocre success. After leaving the White House, Adams demonstrated that true service knows no bounds. Instead of retiring to luxury, he made the incredible decision to return to Congress. There he found his calling once again, this time as a vocal opponent of slavery. His role in Congress was profoundly impactful. He became known as the eloquent, passionate advocate for abolition and for fighting the gag law that prohibited debates about slavery. The years following Adams's presidency were characterized by simplicity rather than extravagance. Unlike many who could indulge in luxury after holding the nation's highest office, Adams chose a life based on modesty. He did not accumulate wealth through public office. Instead, he focused on intellectual pursuits and civic duties. His lifestyle choices reflected his values: simplicity over luxury and substance over style. Number 5. Andrew Johnson. Although John Quincy Adams led a simple life after his presidency, some might think that leaving the nation's highest office would put an end to public battles. But that wasn't the case for Andrew Johnson. His post-presidential years would prove that sometimes the battle to survive in this world transcends the political arena and becomes far more personal and financially uncertain. Often considered one of the poorest people ever to hold office, Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, rose from humble beginnings to the halls of power. Born in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1808, Johnson's early life was marked by financial struggle and personal adversity. Orphaned at a young age, he never had the privilege of a formal education, a fact that didn't deter him but rather fueled his determination to succeed. Johnson's rise from poverty to the presidency is a story of relentless ambition and hard work. As a hapless young apprentice, he taught himself to read and write and developed a passion for debate and public speaking. His political career began when he was elected to the Greenville, Tennessee City Council. With tenacity and an extraordinary ability to connect with ordinary people, he rose through the political ranks, eventually becoming a U.S. governor and senator. Johnson's rise to the presidency occurred under somber circumstances. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln prompted him to assume the office. Unexpectedly, this transition was not easy, as it took place during one of the most turbulent periods in American history: Reconstruction after the Civil War. The economic challenges Johnson faced throughout his life significantly influenced his political decisions. Having experienced poverty firsthand, Johnson was deeply sympathetic to the plight of poor white Southerners during Reconstruction. His lenient policies toward the former Confederate states reflected his belief in swift reintegration without harsh penalties, a stance that made him unpopular with radical Republicans in Congress. This leniency was perceived as weakening efforts to guarantee the rights of newly freed slaves and led to significant discord between Johnson and Congress. His vetoes of civil rights legislation were repeatedly overridden, demonstrating how his economic background clashed with the prevailing political ideologies of the time. Andrew Johnson's presidency became synonymous with conflict and controversy. His opposition to Reconstruction policies reached its peak when he became the first president in U.S. history to be impeached by the House of Representatives, a charge he violated. The term limits law was abolished. Number 4, Thomas Jefferson. While Andrew Johnson lived a simple life by choice, here is the story of another president who succumbed to poverty. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, is widely regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers, known for drafting the Declaration of Independence and orchestrating the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson's contributions to the early development of the country were immense. However, his personal finances were a different story. As president, Jefferson lived comfortably at the Monticello estate, displaying his status as a wealthy plantation owner. While in office, he managed both his personal and national affairs, though cracks in his financial foundation were already appearing. Once out of office in 1801, Jefferson's financial troubles began to unravel more publicly. His vast estate, Monticello, had already been losing money due to Jefferson's lavish lifestyle, poor financial decisions, and the economic downturn following the War of 1812. By the time he retired, he was heavily in debt due to his extravagant spending on books, wine, furniture, and the construction of Monticello itself. Despite having inherited a substantial fortune and owning vast tracts of land and slaves, Jefferson was over $100,000 in debt by the end of his life, an enormous sum for the time. The cause of Jefferson's financial downfall was not only his personal spending, but also his willingness to take on family debts, including those of his father-in-law and daughter. The agricultural industry was in decline, and his estate struggled to generate enough income to keep it afloat. In an attempt to salvage his finances, Jefferson even petitioned the Virginia General Assembly for permission to hold a lottery in 1826 to sell much of his property and Monticello, but this measure did not meet his needs. Jefferson's deteriorating financial situation led him to sell one of his most prized possessions, his extensive personal library. He sold the collection, consisting of approximately 6,500 volumes, to the United States government to help establish the Library of Congress. It was an emotional loss for Jefferson, but a necessity. In his later years, Jefferson struggled immensely to maintain his dignity as his financial situation worsened. Despite his difficulties, he continued to receive guests at Monticello, often resorting to borrowed funds to do so. Number 3, James Garfield. James Abraham Garfield's journey from humble beginnings to the presidency is an example of American ambition and resilience. Born in a log cabin in Ohio, Garfield embodied the classic rags to riches story long before it became a popular cliché. His early life was marked by poverty, as his father died when he was only 2 years old, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. Despite these circumstances, Garfield was driven by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and self-improvement. At a young age, Garfield took on various odd jobs to support his education, including carpentry and even steering canal boats. His determination eventually led him to Williams College in Massachusetts, where he graduated with honors. This academic success propelled him into a career as an educator and later into politics. Garfield's presidency was tragically brief, but not without significance. Elected as the 20th President of the United States in 1880, his time in office was abruptly cut short by an assassin's bullet just 4 months into his term. The sense of urgency surrounding his assassination is palpable. It was a blow not only to his family, but also to the nation that had placed its hopes in his leadership. The period following the assassination was fraught with uncertainty. For 80 agonizing days, Garfield fought for survival as the country watched anxiously. He eventually succumbed to his wounds, leaving his family facing considerable financial strain. Despite holding the highest office in the land, Garfield's untimely death plunged his family into financial hardship. Unlike today's standards, there was no substantial pension or financial safety net for the families of former presidents. At the time, his widow, Lucretia Garfield, faced immediate financial challenges after losing her husband. What might seem unthinkable today, given the stature of their position, was met with community support. Given their position, the community supported them. Public donations helped alleviate some pressures, but they couldn't fully compensate for the lack of a stable income. Garfield's limited presidential salary, while respectable, was insufficient to guarantee long-term financial stability for his family without significant personal savings or investments. Number 2, Herbert Hoover, a name that often conjures up images of economic despair and long lines at soup kitchens in American cities. But before the Great Depression overshadowed his presidency, Hoover was a giant in the business world. Born in a small town in Iowa, Hoover worked his way up to become a respected mining engineer and self-made millionaire. His skills took him around the globe, from the harsh terrain of Australia to the busy mines of China. This globe-trotting entrepreneur was praised for his efficiency and problem-solving abilities. However, despite his professional successes, he also faced criticism. Some people saw him as aloof and inflexible, qualities that would later surface during his political career. When Hoover became president in 1929, he had high hopes for America's prosperity. But fate had other plans. Within months of taking office, the stock market crashed dramatically, leading to the Great Depression. Suddenly, Hoover's initial efforts to revive the economy were overshadowed by a wave of unemployment and poverty. Although he introduced measures such as public works projects and encouraged voluntary cooperation to stabilize the economy, These attempts were mostly seen as too little, too late. Public opinion cooled when Hoovervilles, makeshift towns named in his honor, sprang up across the country, leaving the presidency with a reputation damaged by the economic crisis. One might think that Hoover would retreat into luxury to heal his wounds. Surprisingly, however, this former president chose a path marked by simplicity and service rather than extravagance or self-indulgence. After his presidency ended in 1933, he redirected his energy toward humanitarian efforts, a testament to his resilience and dedication to public service. Before coming to power, Hoover lived modestly after leaving office. He eschewed extravagance in favor of a life dedicated to helping others rebuild their lives amidst widespread hardship. He was actively involved in relief efforts during World War II and played a key role in organizing food aid for war-torn Europe. Number 1. Martin Van Buren. Imagine taking charge of a ship just as a storm begins to form. This was exactly the situation Martin Van Buren found himself in when he became president in 1837, the 8th president of the United States. Van Buren's term in office was plagued by the Panic of 1837, an economic crisis that swept across the nation like a tidal wave, leaving financial ruin in its wake. The Van Buren administration battled widespread bank failures and unemployment. While his policies aimed at economic recovery, they often met with limited success. His presidency is often overshadowed by this financial crisis. After leaving office, one might expect a former president to enjoy a life of comfort and stability. However, Van Buren's reality was quite different. The economic depression that defined his presidency followed him into his post-presidential years like an unwelcome shadow. Despite holding the highest office in the land, Van Buren was never what you would call wealthy. While he owned a large estate called Lindenwohl in Kinderhook, New York, this wasn't a sign of riches, but rather a reflection of his modest lifestyle choices. Bad investments exacerbated his financial woes, forcing him to live simply on his property. He worked his land and focused on enjoying life's simple pleasures. Away from the political spotlight, he found solace in writing and participating in local community affairs. See you in the next video.